When Kelly lands a job at Duncan's Supermart, she thinks it's just another step towards supporting her family until she witnesses her boss, Mr. Duncan, publicly humiliate a young customer, Lisa. What begins as an ordinary conflict quickly spirals into a web of secrets, lies, and a chilling conspiracy. After Mr. Duncan's shady business practices are exposed, the store closes, but Kelly can't shake the feeling that something even darker is lurking behind the closed doors of the now-abandoned Supermart. One night, driven by curiosity and a mysterious stranger's cryptic warnings, Kelly discovers a hidden passage inside the store. What she finds is far more sinister than she could have imagined. Duncan wasn't just selling groceries. As Kelly uncovers layers of blackmail and corruption, she realizes that the town's darkest secrets were being kept right under everyone's noses. But the deeper Kelly digs, the more dangerous things become. With a stranger who seems to know too much and a trail of secrets leading her into a perilous situation, Kelly finds herself trapped between doing what's right and protecting herself from forces that will stop at nothing to keep the truth hidden. Will Kelly expose the dark truths of Duncan's Supermart, or will the secrets buried within its walls remain forever in the shadows? Don't miss this thrilling, suspense-packed story full of twists and unexpected turns. The day started like any other. Kelly was excited. It was her first day working at one of the biggest stores in town, Duncan's Supermart. Her mom had worked there years ago, and Kelly couldn't believe she got the job too. The store was always busy, with people coming in to buy groceries, toys, and clothes. The shelves were stacked high, and the aisles were always full of customers. As she stood behind the counter, Kelly saw people from all over the neighborhood coming in. Some were friendly, some were in a rush, but most were regular customers. Kelly enjoyed helping them, greeting them with a smile. One afternoon, a young girl named Lisa walked into the store. She was around Kelly's age, maybe a little younger. Lisa had shiny black hair and wore simple jeans and a t-shirt. But what stood out most to Kelly was Lisa's bright smile. She looked like she had the whole world ahead of her. Kelly liked Lisa immediately. Lisa walked around the store, looking at clothes and toys, and then picked out a nice dress. She approached Kelly's counter to pay. But as soon as Lisa stepped up, the store manager, Mr. Duncan, came out of his office, glaring at Lisa. He didn't like the way she looked. He never liked seeing people who didn't look rich or fancy in his store. Mr. Duncan walked straight up to Lisa, towering over her. "What are you doing in here?" he asked in a cold voice. "This is no place for you." Lisa looked confused. "I'm just here to buy a dress," she said softly. Mr. Duncan's eyes narrowed. "People like you shouldn't be shopping here. This store is for paying customers, not people who look like they're going to cause trouble." Kelly's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Lisa wasn't doing anything wrong. She just wanted to buy a dress, like everyone else. Kelly felt her stomach twist in knots, but she didn't know what to say. Lisa's face turned red, and tears welled up in her eyes. She couldn't understand why she was being treated this way. She had money, just like anyone else. But before she could speak, Mr. Duncan grabbed the dress out of her hands. "Get out," he snapped. "Go somewhere else." Lisa stumbled back, feeling humiliated. She turned and ran out of the store, tears streaming down her face. Kelly watched in shock, her hands trembling. She wanted to run after Lisa, to apologize, but she was frozen in place. Later that evening, Kelly couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Mr. Duncan was known for being strict, but this was something else. She knew deep down that what he did wasn't right, but she didn't know how to stand up to him. Kelly lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever see Lisa again. The next day at work, the store was buzzing with activity. But Kelly's mind was still on Lisa. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, as if on cue, Lisa walked back into the store. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a tall man in a dark suit, looking serious and important. He had an air of authority, like someone who was used to making big decisions. Kelly immediately recognized him. He was Mr. Wilson, the CEO of one of the largest companies in the city. Kelly's heart started to pound in her chest. What was he doing with Lisa? As they approached the counter, Mr. Duncan's face turned pale. He recognized Mr. Wilson too, and the realization of who Lisa was seemed to hit him like a punch in the gut. Mr. Wilson wasn't just any CEO, he was Lisa's father. "I believe you owe my daughter an apology," Mr. Wilson said in a deep, calm voice. Mr. Duncan stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was too late. Everyone in the store had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Kelly stood silently, her eyes wide with anticipation. "You treated her like she didn't belong here," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice steady but filled with anger. "My daughter deserves to shop wherever she pleases, and I won't stand for anyone disrespecting her." Mr. Duncan's face was bright red now. He looked like he wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. "I didn't know she was your daughter," he finally managed to say. "It doesn't matter whose daughter she is." Mr. Wilson shot back. "You treated her poorly because of how she looked, and that's unacceptable." Kelly's heart swelled with pride for Mr. Wilson. She wanted to cheer him on, to tell him how much she admired him for standing up for his daughter. But she stayed quiet, watching as Mr. Duncan fumbled for words. Mr. Wilson turned to Lisa, giving her a kind smile. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "We don't need to waste our time in places like this." And with that, he took Lisa's hand, and they walked out of the store together, leaving Mr. Duncan standing there, speechless. Kelly watched them go, her heart racing. She had never seen anything like this before. Mr. Duncan's store had always been the most important place in the town, but now it seemed small and unimportant. Everything had changed. But little did Kelly know, this was just the beginning. As soon as Lisa and Mr. Wilson walked out, the store felt different. The customers whispered to each other, exchanging shocked glances. Mr. Duncan, still standing by the counter, was frozen. His face was a mix of embarrassment and anger, and his hands trembled. Kelly's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him. But then, something strange happened. Instead of apologizing or explaining himself, Mr. Duncan turned and stormed back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The loud bang echoed through the store, and everyone flinched. Kelly felt her stomach twist. She knew that Mr. Duncan was furious, but she had no idea what he would do next. That night, Kelly couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the scene in her head. Lisa had been humiliated, and it wasn't fair. And what Mr. Duncan had done to her was even worse. Kelly wished she had spoken up, but fear had kept her silent. What if Mr. Duncan fired her for saying something? The next morning, Kelly arrived at the store early, hoping to avoid Mr. Duncan. But as soon as she walked in, she saw him standing by the front door. His face was red, and he was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Kelly swallowed hard and quickly made her way to the counter. As the day went on, Kelly noticed that the store was unusually quiet. People seemed to be avoiding it, and those who did come in didn't stay long. Word had spread about what happened to Lisa, and it was clear that the community wasn't happy. Then, around noon, something unexpected happened. A sleek, black car pulled up in front of the store, and out stepped Mr. Wilson, this time without Lisa. Kelly's heart skipped a beat. What was he doing back here? Mr. Wilson walked into the store with a calm, yet serious expression on his face. Mr. Duncan, who had been hiding in his office, came out as soon as he saw him. "You again?" Mr. Duncan said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. Mr. Wilson didn't waste any time. "I came to make something very clear," he said, his voice cold. "I will not stand for my daughter or anyone else to be treated like that in this town. And trust me, Mr. Duncan, people will hear about this." Mr. Duncan's face turned pale again, and he opened his mouth to argue, but Mr. Wilson cut him off. "I own several businesses in this town," Mr. Wilson continued, "and I've already made a few calls. Your reputation is going to suffer because of what you did." Kelly's eyes widened. She had known that Mr. Wilson had so much power in the community. It was clear now that he was serious, and Mr. Duncan looked like he was about to crumble under the pressure. But instead of backing down, Mr. Duncan did something no one expected. He crossed his arms and sneered. "You think you can threaten me?" he spat. "This is my store. I can treat whoever I want however I want. And I don't care who you are." Kelly gasped. She couldn't believe Mr. Duncan was being so bold, especially after what had happened the day before. Mr. Wilson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the whole store went silent. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in one swift motion, Mr. Wilson pulled out his phone and started typing. Mr. Duncan frowned, confused. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Mr. Wilson didn't answer. He just kept typing. And after a few seconds, he looked up at Mr. Duncan with a smirk on his face. "You'll find out soon enough," he said calmly, then turned and walked out of the store without another word. The next few days were strange. Kelly noticed that fewer and fewer people were coming to the store. Customers seemed to disappear, and the shelves stayed fully stocked. It was as if the store had lost its place in the town. People were avoiding it like the plague. Then, one evening, Kelly overheard a conversation between two women who had come in to shop. "Did you hear what Mr. Wilson posted online?" one of the women asked. The other woman nodded. "I did. He's telling everyone in town to boycott this place. Says Duncan's is no longer a store that welcomes everyone." Kelly's heart sank. Mr. Wilson had used his influence to spread the word about what happened to Lisa, and now the whole town knew. People were taking a stand, refusing to shop at Duncan's. Kelly could feel the weight of what was happening, and she knew that the store's future was in jeopardy. The next day, Mr. Duncan called Kelly into his office. His face was pale, and he looked more tired than she had ever seen him. "I need your help," he said, his voice shaking. Kelly blinked, confused. "My help?" Mr. Duncan nodded. "I know you were there when it happened," he said quietly. "I need you to tell people that it was all a misunderstanding, that Lisa wasn't treated badly." Kelly stared at him in shock. How could he ask her to lie? She had seen everything with her own eyes. Lisa had been treated terribly, and now Mr. Duncan wanted her to cover for him. "No," Kelly said firmly, surprising even herself. "I can't do that." Mr. Duncan's face twisted with anger. "You work for me," he snapped. "You'll do what I tell you, or you're fired." But Kelly didn't back down. "Then fire me," she said, her voice steady. "I won't lie for you." Mr. Duncan glared at her for a long moment, but then he slumped back in his chair, defeated. He knew that Kelly wasn't going to change her mind, and he also knew that without her help, his store was doomed. Kelly walked out of the office, her heart pounding. She knew she had done the right thing, but she also knew that things were about to get even more complicated. Mr. Duncan wasn't the kind of man to give up easily, and Kelly had a feeling that the storm was far from over. As Kelly walked back to her counter, she could feel the tension in the air. The store was almost empty, and the few customers who did come in barely made eye contact with her. She knew they had heard the rumors, and it made her stomach twist. Still, she stood tall, trying to focus on the task at hand. Later that evening, after her shift, Kelly walked home with her head down, thinking about everything that had happened. She had stood up to Mr. Duncan, but now she wasn't sure what would happen next. She was just a small-town girl working a job to help her family, and the last thing she wanted was to be caught in the middle of this growing feud between Mr. Duncan and Mr. Wilson. The next morning, Kelly woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. Groggily, she picked it up and saw dozens of messages from friends, family, and people from school. Everyone was talking about Duncan's Supermart and the drama between Mr. Duncan and Mr. Wilson. But there was something else. A video. Curious, Kelly clicked on the link, and her jaw dropped. Someone had filmed the entire scene between Mr. Duncan and Lisa, and it had gone viral. The video showed everything. Mr. Duncan yelling at Lisa, Mr. Wilson confronting him, and Kelly standing behind the counter, frozen in shock. The video had millions of views, and people from all over were commenting on how unfairly Lisa had been treated. Kelly's heart raced. The video was everywhere, on social media, news sites, and even on the local news channel. She couldn't believe it. What had started as a small argument in the store was now a full-blown scandal. When Kelly arrived at work, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Duncan was in his office, shouting into his phone, and the few employees who were left were whispering nervously. Kelly knew the store's reputation was crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before things got worse. Later that day, Mr. Duncan called all the employees into a meeting. He looked furious, his face red, and his hand shaking. "We are under attack," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "That video is nothing but lies, and I will not let this store go down because of it." Kelly stood at the back of the room, watching as Mr. Duncan ranted and raved. He was trying to control the situation, but it was clear that he had already lost. The town had turned against him, and people were no longer willing to shop at a place that treated customers so poorly. But then, just when Kelly thought things couldn't get any worse, the door to the meeting room swung open. Standing in the doorway was Lisa. She was calm, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm not here to fight," Lisa said, her voice steady. "I just want to talk." Mr. Duncan's face twisted in anger. "You have no right to be here," he snapped. But Lisa didn't back down. "I do," she said firmly. "I have every right to be here. What you did to me was wrong, and you know it." Kelly's heart pounded as she watched the two of them face off. She could feel the tension in the room, and it was clear that everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Duncan crossed his arms, glaring at Lisa. "What do you want?" Lisa took a deep breath. "I want you to admit what you did," she said. "I want you to apologize, not just to me, but to everyone you've treated unfairly." Mr. Duncan scoffed. "Apologize? You've got to be kidding me." But Lisa didn't flinch. "It's the only way," she said softly. "If you want to save this store, if you want people to come back, you have to make things right." For a moment, the room was silent. Mr. Duncan stared at Lisa, his jaw clenched. He looked like he was about to explode, but then something unexpected happened. His shoulders slumped, and the fire in his eyes faded. He looked tired, defeated. He started to say, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "I was just trying to protect my business." Kelly's eyes widened in surprise. She had never seen Mr. Duncan like this before, vulnerable, almost human. But Lisa wasn't done. "It's not just about me," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's about how you treat everyone who comes into the store. You can't keep treating people like they don't matter." Mr. Duncan was silent for a long time. The room was so quiet that Kelly could hear her own heartbeat. Everyone was waiting for his response. Finally, he sighed. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made mistakes. I've treated people unfairly. I'm sorry." Kelly couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mr. Duncan, stubborn, prideful Mr. Duncan, was actually apologizing. It didn't seem real. Lisa nodded, her face softening. "Thank you," she said simply. "But words aren't enough. You have to show people that you've changed." Mr. Duncan looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I will," he promised. "I'll make things right." Lisa smiled, and for the first time since the incident, the tension in the room seemed to ease. Kelly felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe, just maybe, things would be okay after all. But just as everyone started to relax, the door burst open again, and this time, it wasn't Lisa's father or a customer. It was the police. The room froze as two officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room before settling on Mr. Duncan. "We need to have a word with you," one of them said sternly. Kelly's heart dropped. What was going on now? She looked over at Lisa, who seemed just as confused as everyone else. Mr. Duncan's face turned pale, and he swallowed hard. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice shaky. The officer stepped forward, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "We've received several complaints about this store," he said. "And about you." Kelly's blood ran cold. Complaints? What kind of complaints? She looked around the room, her mind racing. What was happening? What had Mr. Duncan done? The officer handed Mr. Duncan the paper. "You're going to need to come with us," he said. And just like that, everything Kelly thought she knew about Mr. Duncan, about the store, came crashing down. But this was only the beginning. Mr. Duncan stood frozen, staring at the paper in the officer's hand. The room was filled with tension, and Kelly could feel it in the air like a thick fog. Everyone was waiting for Mr. Duncan to react, but he didn't move. What is this?" Mr. Duncan stammered, his voice weak. His hands trembled as he finally took the paper from the officer. The officer crossed his arms, his expression serious. We've received reports of discriminatory practices in your store, along with other allegations of unethical business conduct. You need to come with us for questioning." Kelly's heart raced. Discriminatory practices? Other unethical conduct? The words swirled in her mind as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Could this be about what happened to Lisa? Or was there something more going on that no one knew about? Mr. Duncan's face went from pale to red in seconds. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each of his employees, then back to the police officers. "This is absurd," he yelled. "You can't just walk into my store and accuse me of crimes. This is all a misunderstanding." The officer remained calm. "Sir, we're not here to arrest you," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We're here to investigate the claims. If everything is a misunderstanding, you'll have the chance to explain yourself." Mr. Duncan's lips tightened. For a moment, he looked like he was about to argue, but then his shoulders slumped. He nodded slowly, as if all the fight had left him. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll go with you, but I'm innocent. I've done nothing wrong." The officers gestured for him to follow them, and as they led Mr. Duncan out of the store, Kelly could feel everyone's eyes on her. The air was thick with silence, the kind that made your skin crawl. She glanced at Lisa, who was standing by the door, looking shocked and confused. This wasn't what anyone had expected. After Mr. Duncan left, the store fell into chaos. People began whispering, some employees even walked out, too shaken to continue their shifts. Kelly stayed behind the counter, gripping the edge tightly, trying to steady her nerves. The day had turned into something out of a nightmare, and she didn't know how to make sense of it. Later, Lisa approached her, her face a mixture of emotions. "Kelly," she said softly, I didn't know this was going to happen. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble." Kelly shook her head. "It's not your fault, Lisa," she replied, her voice trembling. "What happened to you is wrong, and if Mr. Duncan's done more bad things, then maybe this is for the best." Lisa nodded, but still looked uneasy. I hope things can get better now." Kelly didn't know what to say. She hoped for the same thing, but the way things were unraveling, it didn't feel like they were moving towards something better. It felt like the ground beneath them was crumbling, and no one knew how to stop it. Over the next few days, the town buzzed with rumors. People talked about Mr. Duncan's arrest, the complaints against him, and whether Duncan's Supermart would ever open its doors again. Kelly tried to stay out of the gossip, but it was impossible to avoid. Everywhere she went, people asked her what had happened, as if she held the answers to all the town's questions. Then one morning, Kelly received a letter in the mail. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was from Mr. Duncan's lawyer. The letter was brief, but its message was clear. Mr. Duncan was suing Mr. Wilson for defamation. He claimed that Mr. Wilson's public statements had ruined his reputation and caused his store to lose business. Kelly's stomach turned as she read the letter. A lawsuit? This was spiraling out of control. As the days passed, Kelly watched as the lawsuit unfolded. Both sides hired expensive lawyers, and the case quickly became the talk of the town. The courtroom was packed every day, with people eager to see what would happen. Kelly didn't attend the trial, but she read the news and listened to what people were saying. The case took a dark turn when Mr. Duncan's lawyer brought forward evidence that shocked everyone. Hidden cameras had been found in the store, cameras that no one, not even the employees, knew about. Mr. Duncan had been secretly recording his staff and customers for months, and the footage revealed more than just poor treatment. It showed unethical practices, mistreatment of employees, and even illegal activity. Kelly's world came crashing down. The man she had worked for wasn't just rude or unfair. He was corrupt. The video footage was played in court, and the whole town watched as Mr. Duncan's reputation crumbled to dust. There was no defending him anymore. The trial dragged on for weeks, but in the end, Mr. Duncan lost. He was fined heavily and ordered to pay damages to Mr. Wilson and Lisa. Duncan's Supermart was shut down for good, and the building was put up for sale. But the story didn't end there. After the trial, Lisa's father, Mr. Wilson, approached Kelly. "You've been through a lot," he said kindly. "I saw how you stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. You have integrity, and I respect that." Kelly looked up at him, surprised. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "I'm planning to open a new store," Mr. Wilson continued. "A place where everyone is welcome, no matter who they are. And I'd like you to be part of it." Kelly's heart skipped a beat. A new store? Working for Mr. Wilson? It was more than she had ever dreamed of. "I don't know what to say," Kelly said, her voice trembling. Mr. Wilson smiled. "Just say yes." Kelly did. And so, the dark chapter of Duncan's Supermart came to an end, but a new, brighter chapter was about to begin. Mr. Wilson's new store opened its doors a few months later, and it was everything he promised it would be: warm, welcoming, and full of life. Kelly was proud to be part of it, and every day she saw people from all walks of life coming together, laughing, shopping, and enjoying the community they had built. But as Kelly worked in the new store, there was always a lingering thought in the back of her mind. Mr. Duncan was gone, but the damage he had done couldn't be erased so easily. People still whispered about him, about the secrets he had kept, and about the strange things that had happened in his store before it closed. And Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something was still hidden in the shadows. Something no one had uncovered yet. Kelly tried to push the unsettling feeling to the back of her mind, but it lingered like a cloud that wouldn't go away. Every time she walked past the old Duncan's Supermart building, which now stood vacant and forgotten, a shiver ran down her spine. The place had an eerie stillness to it, as if it was holding onto secrets long buried beneath the surface. One afternoon, a few weeks after Mr. Wilson's new store opened, Kelly was stacking shelves when a man walked in. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and deep-set eyes that scanned the store with a sharp intensity. Something about him felt off. He wore a faded leather jacket and seemed out of place among the cheerful customers. Kelly watched him from the corner of her eye, her instincts telling her to be cautious. The man moved quietly through the aisles, barely touching anything. He wasn't shopping. He was looking for something or someone. Finally, he approached the counter where Kelly stood. "You worked at Duncan's, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Kelly tensed. "Yes, I did," she said cautiously, her eyes meeting his. "Why do you ask?" The man smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm looking into what happened there," he said, leaning in slightly. "There's more to that store than what people know." Kelly's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's eyes glinted with something dark. "Let's just say, Duncan's wasn't only failing because of bad management. There were other things going on, and I think you know more than you're letting on." Kelly's mind raced. Other things? What could he be talking about? She thought back to the hidden cameras, the strange footage, the complaints, but was there more? "I don't know what you're talking about," Kelly said firmly, trying to shake the uneasy feeling building inside her. The man chuckled, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb. You worked there. You must have seen things, heard things. People like Duncan don't just fall from grace without a reason." Kelly took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Look, I don't know who you are or what you're trying to suggest, but if you want answers, I think you're looking in the wrong place. The store's closed. Duncan's gone." The man's expression darkened. He may be gone, but his secrets aren't. People are still asking questions, and sooner or later, the truth is going to come out. Kelly's pulse quickened. What truth? The man stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You'll find out soon enough." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the store, leaving Kelly standing there, her mind reeling. What had just happened? Who was that man? And what was he talking about? For the rest of the day, Kelly couldn't shake the conversation from her mind. She kept thinking about the hidden cameras, the strange way Mr. Duncan had acted before everything came crashing down. Had there been more going on behind the scenes than she realized? That night, Kelly found herself unable to sleep. The man's words echoed in her head, and curiosity gnawed her. She didn't want to believe that there were more secrets hidden in Duncan's Supermart, but the feeling wouldn't leave her alone. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, she grabbed her jacket and left her house, making her way to the old store. The streets were quiet, and the night air was cool. The vacant building loomed ahead of her, dark and silent. Kelly stood outside the entrance, her heart pounding. The windows were covered in dust, and the doors were locked, but something inside was calling to her, pulling her closer. She knew it was crazy, but she had to know the truth. As she circled the building, she found a back door that had been left slightly ajar. Her breath hitched. Someone had been here recently. Swallowing her fear, Kelly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the shelves were empty. The store felt like a ghost of what it once was. But there was something else, a faint humming sound, coming from somewhere deep inside the building. Kelly followed the sound, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she moved through the aisles, memories of her time working at Duncan's flashed in her mind. The laughter, the conversations, the customers. But now, the place felt haunted, like it was holding on to something sinister. The humming grew louder as she approached the manager's office. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the office looked just as it had the last time she'd been there, but the humming was coming from the wall. Kelly's eyes narrowed. She walked over to the wall and pressed her ear against it, her heart racing. The sound was mechanical, like something was running behind the wall. Then she saw it, a small panel, barely visible, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. Kelly crouched down and carefully moved the boxes aside. Her breath caught in her throat. The panel had a keypad and a fingerprint scanner. What was this? Kelly's mind raced. Was this connected to the cameras? Was this what the man had been talking about? She hesitated for a moment, then reached for the keypad. But before she could do anything, the door behind her slammed shut. Kelly spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway was the same man from earlier, the one who had come to the store. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, and a sinister smile spread across his face. "I told you," he said, stepping closer. "There are secrets here, and now you're part of them." Kelly's mind raced as she backed away from the panel, her heart pounding. She was trapped. The man took another step toward her, his smile growing wider. "I've been waiting for someone like you to find this," he said, his voice cold. "Now, we can finally uncover the truth." Kelly's hands shook as she looked around the room, searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped in the heart of a mystery she never wanted to be part of. And the truth, whatever it was about to be revealed. Kelly's breath quickened as the man closed in. The dim light cast shadows across his face, making his features look even more menacing. Her back was against the wall, and her mind raced for a way out. "What do you want?" Kelly asked, her voice trembling. She felt the cold metal of the hidden panel behind her. The man's smile didn't fade. "I don't want to hurt you, Kelly," he said smoothly. "I just need you to help me unlock this secret. You were so close after all." Kelly's hand instinctively moved over the panel, her fingers tracing the keypad. "What's behind this wall?" she asked, trying to buy time, her eyes darting around for any possible escape. The man chuckled darkly. "Let's just say it's the key to everything Mr. Duncan was hiding. All his dirty little secrets. You've seen the cameras, haven't you? This store wasn't just selling groceries." Kelly's mind spun as she tried to piece it together. Cameras, secret panels, illegal activities. "What was he doing here?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying her confusion. "Mr. Duncan had quite the side business," he said, stepping closer. "Let's just say certain people in town paid him to keep an eye on things. He was good at collecting information, blackmail, even. He had leverage on a lot of important people who wanted to make sure their secrets stayed hidden." Kelly's heart sank. She had known Mr. Duncan was unethical, but this was far worse than she imagined. "Blackmail?" she whispered, horrified. The man nodded, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "You think his business was going under because of bad sales? No. It's because he got greedy. He started using what he found to control people. But he went too far. Someone didn't like what he was doing, and now he's gone. But the information? It's still here." Kelly's stomach twisted. "And you're trying to get it," she realized. The man's smile widened. "Exactly. And you, my dear, are going to help me." He motioned toward the panel. "You're going to open that door." Kelly's hand hovered over the keypad, her mind racing. She couldn't let this man get what he wanted, but she had no idea what would happen if she refused. She needed to stall, to think. "I don't know the code," she said truthfully, trying to keep her voice calm. The man sighed, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You worked here. You must have seen Mr. Duncan use it. Think." Kelly's fingers shook as she stared at the panel. She had never seen anyone use it, but she remembered how meticulous Mr. Duncan had been about certain things. He always used the same password for his office computer. His ego was so big, he'd made it his birthday. Taking a deep breath, Kelly hesitantly typed in the numbers she remembered from his employee records. 091265, September 12th, 1965. The keypad blinked red for a moment, then flashed green. There was a loud click, and a hidden door in the wall slowly slid open, revealing a dark passageway. Kelly's heart leaped into her throat. She had no idea what was down there, but she knew it couldn't be good. The man's eyes lit up with excitement as he stepped forward. "Good girl," he murmured. He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the passage. "Now, let's see what Mr. Duncan has been hiding." Kelly stumbled, her mind screaming for her to run, but the man's grip was tight. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as they entered the dark corridor. It smelled damp and cold, and the dim light from the room behind them quickly faded as they moved deeper into the tunnel. The passage led to a small underground room. Inside, there were stacks of old boxes and filing cabinets, along with a strange, humming machine in the corner. Kelly couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. It looked like a storage area for something far more important than groceries. The man released Kelly's arm and rushed toward the filing cabinets, rifling through papers and folders. His movements were frantic, desperate. "This is it," he muttered to himself. "Everything we need." Kelly took a step back, glancing around the room. Her eyes landed on the humming machine. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Old, rusted, but still operational. There were wires connected to it that snaked along the walls, disappearing into the ceiling. "What is this place?" Kelly asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man ignored her, still frantically searching through the papers. "This is where Mr. Duncan kept all his leverage. Contracts, photos, videos, everything he used to control the town's most powerful people." Kelly's skin prickled with fear. "What are you going to do with it?" The man stopped and turned to her, his eyes dark with greed. "I'm going to finish what Mr. Duncan started. Only this time, I'm not going to make the same mistake he did." Kelly's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He stepped closer to her, his smile cold. "Mr. Duncan got too cocky. He thought he could use this information to rule over everyone. But me? I'm going to sell it. Every dirty secret, every piece of leverage, someone will pay a lot of money for this." Kelly felt a surge of panic. If he sold this information, it could destroy lives. She had to stop him, but how? Her eyes darted back to the humming machine. Whatever it was, it seemed important. Maybe it was part of Mr. Duncan's surveillance system, or maybe it stored all the data. Desperate, Kelly made a decision. Before the man could react, Kelly bolted toward the machine. She grabbed one of the wires and yanked with all her strength. The room filled with a sharp, electric whine as the machine sputtered and died. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered. "No!" the man shouted, lunging toward her. "What have you done?" Kelly backed away, her heart racing. The machine was smoking now, its hum completely gone. Whatever secrets it held were gone too. The man grabbed her arm, his grip painfully tight. "Do you have any idea what you've just destroyed?" he growled, shaking her. Kelly looked him in the eye, her fear replaced by a steely resolve. "I wasn't going to let you ruin more lives." The man's face twisted with rage, but before he could say anything, there was a loud crash from behind them. Both Kelly and the man turned to see two police officers standing in the doorway, guns drawn. "Step away from her," one of the officers commanded. The man froze, his grip on Kelly loosening. Kelly quickly pulled free, stumbling back toward the officers. The man sneered, but he raised his hands in surrender. "You have no idea what you've just cost me," he hissed at Kelly. The officers quickly handcuffed him and led him out of the room. Kelly followed, her legs shaking with adrenaline. As they reached the surface, the cold night air hit her, and she breathed a sigh of relief. It was over, but as Kelly stood outside the old store, watching the officers drive away with the man in the back seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were still more secrets buried in Duncan's Supermart. And she wasn't sure she ever wanted to know what they were. Hey, everyone! If you found value in this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I read every one of them. And make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep this conversation going. Your voice matters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.